Welcome to Grass Pollen Allergy and AIT, Latest Evidence and Guidelines, a Q&A with Professor Richard Harvey and Associate Professor Ed Newbigin. This discussion explores key new data and guideline changes that inform the optimal management of seasonal allergic rhinitis patients who are polysensitized to both temperate and subtropical grass pollens. To illuminate this common and important clinical challenge, Ed will bring the perspective of a pollen biologist, whilst Richard will bring the perspective of a practicing clinician and clinical researcher. Ed is a plant biologist in the School of Biosciences in the University of Melbourne. He has nearly 30 years research experience in the areas of the cellular and molecular biology of plants. He is also coordinator of the Melbourne Pollen Count, which he has been since 1997. Richard is a dedicated rhinologist based in Sydney who has active clinical research interests in allergy. These interests have included key recent studies on patterns of grass pollen sensitizations and AIT effectiveness in Australian patients with allergic rhinitis due to grass pollen allergy. Richard is Program Head of Rhinology and Skull-Based Surgery at the Applied Medical Research Centre of the University of New South Wales, and he is also Professor at both the University of New South Wales and Macquarie University. The recording of this medical education video was facilitated by the Stallergenes Greer Asia Pacific Medical Affairs Department.
Well, you can see the list of grasses which are of most concern for allergy sufferers here. I wanted to give a little bit of context to this first and just talk about grasses in general. And rather strangely, I'm going to start by talking about people, just to give a bit of context for those of our listeners who are not taxonomists. And that is, people are Homo sapiens, and so we are in a genus of Homo, and our family, the family to which we belong, called the hominids, has 8 other members currently existing. So the family of humans, the great apes, has got 8 species in it. And if we go even higher than that, up to what's called the class level, and consider all the mammals there are on the planet, we've got around about 4,500 or 6,500 species of mammals on the planet. Let's flip over and talk about grasses. Grasses are a family of plants, and there are about 12,000 members of the grass family. So humans, the family of which we belong, it's got 8 species in it. Grasses, we've got about 12,000 species. And they dominate all the ecosystems of the world, all the terrestrial ecosystems of the world. So you find grasses on all continents, including Antarctica, where there's a grass called Antarctic hairgrass. So it's huge diversity of grasses. And getting back to talking about mammals, those grasses dominate ecosystems like the steppes in Central Asia. In Africa, they dominate the veldt. In South America, it's the pampas grasses. Across North America, it's the prairies. These are the grass-dominated ecosystems. And those grasses support large numbers of grazing mammals. Now I think that's an interesting point to make, because we, human beings, are a grazing mammal as well, especially if you've ever seen someone going up to the buffet lunch. You've seen someone going grazing. So we've taken those ecosystems dominated by large numbers of different grasses, 12,000 different species, and we've reduced it down to a very small number of species of grass. So what you're looking at here is, these are not just randomly chosen grasses, these are major pasture grasses that we use to supply our animals, the animals that we feed off. So we've got ryegrass and meadowgrass and so on. These are major pasture grasses. In Australia and in New Zealand as well, they're the pasture grasses which are supplying underlying our dairy industries and our sheep industries. Family of grasses, we've got a big division between the two types of within the grasses, and we can talk about the grasses which do well in temperate parts of the world, those which are well away from the equator, where you get clear seasons emerging, and then those which are more around the tropical areas, and that's a taxonomic division within the grasses. There are two big groups of grasses. In the temperate grasses, most of our crops are found. So we've got things like wheat and barley and rice. Those are temperate grasses. And in the subtropical grasses, the ones which are found closer towards the equator, we find things like corn. And that follows another part of an ecology that underlies these grasses. The temperate grasses, they're grasses which are limited, their growing seasons are limited by temperature. So we have distinct winter when it's too cold for these grasses to grow, and then summer when the grasses are no longer temperature limited. As you move closer towards the equator, you've got a different set of problems. You've got very distinct wet and dry seasons. So temperature is no longer a limiting factor. It's more about availability of water. So the subtropical grasses respond to those annual monsoonal events, whereas the temperate grasses, their growth is dominated by that movement out of winter, a deep cold winter, and into spring. So the reason we've got the grasses, the allergenic grasses we have, is because they are the major pasture grasses, and also we've got where they grow well, where they have the greatest capacity to supply fodder to growing animals. So some of these grasses are better adapted to growing in subtropical areas, and some of them are better adapted to growing in temperate areas of the world. And we can see that very clearly in these images. And this is showing, on the left, you've got the main ecological areas of Australia. And in the blue, you've got the temperate zones are shown in blue. And on the right-hand side, you've got some data from the Atlas of Living Australia, which is showing the distribution of ryegrass, which is one of the major grass types that underlies a lot of Australia's pastures. And you can see that the ryegrass pastures overlap those temperate zones. Subtropical grasses are also found across these areas, but they tend to be higher up in Australia. We often think of Australia as having the northern half of it is much more monsoonal in its weather patterns, and the southern half of Australia is temperate. And so you'll find those subtropical grasses up in the high parts of Australia, and it's the pasture grasses, the temperate grasses, which are found in the southern parts of Australia. When we look over in New Zealand, many of the same sorts of issues arise there. There's been a lot of modification of the landscape, and dairying, sheep grazing are major activities of agriculture in New Zealand. And we can see a lot of the ryegrass occurs there as well. That's the temperate grasses, but you can also have subtropical grasses as well in New Zealand, because some of those parts of New Zealand, it's a long, thin country which covers a lot of different latitudes. It goes up and down. So some of those areas get to be quite temperate as subtropical as well. The simple answer to that question is yes, they do flower at different times. So the temperate grasses flower, as I said before, as they're moving out of winter and into spring. So they're no longer limited by temperature. They've got enough temperature, the ground, the soils have warmed up, and that's when they're if there's adequate water around, that's when they'll start to flower. When we're looking at the subtropical grasses, they can't grow during a lot of the year because it's too dry, and they're waiting for those monsoonal events to occur. So those large rainfall events which you get across tropical and subtropical Australia, which come starting in November and going through until March and April. So that's when they've got enough water to flower, and that's when we start to see their pollen. So they need that water to occur, then we get grass growth occurring, and then we can see at the end of the growing season, the production of flowers and the release of pollen. So we tend to see two distinct peaks of grass pollen production, and that the peaks are different at different places, different latitudes. As you go down, starting in this slide, we've got Hobart, very hard winter, also quite cold, even rainfall pretty much across the year. So they've got that classical signal of a temperate grass pollen season, and that comes, and as we get a very distinct seasonality, so we've got spring and summer. As we come up into Sydney, we're starting to get more of that feel of some of those. Yes, we've got a clear winter, but we've also got more of some of those tropical elements to the climate as well. And we can see some of the temperate grasses coming along, but also more of the subtropical grasses. So we get a distinct second peak of grass pollen occurring later in the summer, towards the end of the summer and into the autumn. And as we get to Brisbane, we've got, it's really less appropriate to talk about distinct springs and summer, where we've got very much more wet and dry seasons. Then we see much more of the subtropical grasses coming along towards the end of that summer. So from January and February onwards is when most of the grass pollen is seen. So that's going to have clinical implications. Richard, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think if you pointed out something really important, Ed, is that Australia really crosses so many latitudes, and the geographical differences are so varied between, you know, Brisbane to Hobart, that when you're assessing patients, taking their history, understanding when they get their symptoms, you really have to be aware of your own microgeographic climate and what's going to be likely in the area that you and your patients live, to understand what to expect from grass pollination. This is the real conundrum for clinicians, in that in Australia, being such a large country in different climatic regions, we do have patients that are exposed to two different types of grasses, temperate grasses, as we've been talking about, but also subtropical grasses. Explain to me the significance here of the 37th latitude south. So
that line 37 south kind of marks where, as far the point where the subtropical grasses sort of start to end off. We don't see too much of those below that point, and so above that area we start to see more of the subtropical grasses as well. And by the time you get up to Brisbane, the subtropical grasses are starting to dominate, but there's an area between those two, between 37 South and Brisbane, where you're getting a mix of both types of grass occurring. And that's not only going to be influenced by latitude, but it's also going to be how far inland you are as well. So you can imagine that as you go further inland into New South Wales, you're going to see get less of that, those big downpours, the ends of those monsoonal troughs coming down out of the north and giving a lot of wetness. They're going to be much more dominated by the same sorts of weather patterns that you see elsewhere in southern Australia. So inland, parts of inland New South Wales are got less of that tropical influence than along the coast. So that's another factor to bear in there as well.
But you think the 37th latitude is a good marking point to separate?
Yeah, below that point, in Melbourne, we see very little of the subtropical grasses. They certainly grow around the place, but we don't, the pastures in Victoria are not dominated by them, and certainly by the time you get to Tasmania, they're almost completely absent. As you go further north, we can start to see increasing amounts of those types of pasture grasses, and by the time you get up to Brisbane, it's those pastures which are dominated, and they're the ones which are giving most of the pollen which is being seen up in Queensland.
And as a clinician, I mean, you might be able to interpret a peak of symptoms before the end of the year, before December, as being temperate based. But I think as you go north, you see these multiple peaks, which might be, Ed, what a combination of subtropical sensitization, but also maybe a longer ryegrass pollinization period.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that the ryegrasses will kick on for too long. So I think it's more going to be that as you move further north, you're getting those subtropical grasses starting to dominate as well. So I think that we've got two distinct peaks: late spring, early summer. Those temperate grasses are flowering, getting into late summer, early autumn, if we can think of that time. February, March, April is going to be when you'll start to see those subtropical grasses flowering. Yes, they do. There's a very distinct seasonal pattern of allergy for grass pollen allergies, and typically, I'm from Melbourne, it starts sometime in late October or early November is when we start to see the big bulk of our grass pollen allergies occurring. And we believe that to be largely driven by ryegrass, which is the main pasture grass, and it's capable of producing large volumes of grass pollen which get released into the air. So ryegrass pastures dominate the western half of Victoria, the state of Victoria. Grasses like ryegrass have got two major allergen types. Ryegrass is lowly perenne, and it has a type 1 allergen called LOLP5, and that's a protein which is very easily released by the pollen grain when it lands in the eyes and the nose and so on, and that can cause, maybe associated with allergic rhinitis. And then another major allergen is a type 5 allergens, and in ryegrass that's called LOLP5, and that's borne on small starch particles which are held within the pollen grain, and that's less easily released just by casual exposure to the eyes and nose, but it can be released. These small starch particles can be released if the pollen grain gets ruptured, and it's those small particles which can get into the lung and cause asthma. So we think they're more associated with asthma attacks than LOLP1, which is more associated with allergic rhinitis. Would you agree with that, Richard?
Yeah, Ed, so I mean, in my world, it's largely recognized that larger particles deposit in the upper airway, the smaller ones in the lower airway. You know, I look at this data and just want to know, you know, what is the antigenicity between, you know, LOLP1 and LOLP5, because that would determine the severity of symptoms at each of these sites.
There is some data which does suggest that LOLP5 is more associated with asthma than LOLP1. These are some data from Mark Hughes' lab, which have come about following up from the thunderstorm asthma event in Victoria back in 2016. And so we've got two groups of people here, those people who turned up at emergency departments who suffered from thunderstorm asthma, and another cohort who are grass pollen sensitized but did not experience thunderstorm asthma. And just looking at their sensitivity to either LOLP1, the group 1 allergen, or LOLP5, the group 5 allergen, you can see that these people who had thunderstorm asthma have a high sensitization to LOLP5, and there was no difference seen between their sensitization to LOLP1. So that's the kind of evidence which is suggesting that LOLP5 may be more important as a causation of asthma than LOLP1.
Yeah, I mean, that shows that it's not only more sensitization, but also delivery to lower airway that brings about those events and thunderstorms.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, when you look at asthma-related hospital admissions in Melbourne, you can clearly see that there's a peak here around the October-November period. You know, how can we explain this based on pollinization and grass growth?
Yeah, so it's a very distinct peak. It shows up every season, and the severity of that peak is really driven by how much grass pollen there is seen during that season. So growth of grasses, you don't have to be much of a gardener to understand that the growth of grasses is driven by how much rainfall you're getting. So in drier years, we're going to see less grass. In wetter years, we're going to see more grass. So we've got this clear peak of grass pollen driven allergies, and embedded within that peak are the thunderstorm asthma events. So thunderstorm asthma occurs within that peak as well. So it's a regular seasonal event in Melbourne, and it's buried within a larger peak of people which are turning up to hospital. These are people who are being admitted to ward, so they're severely ill people with asthma.
And Ed, I assume it's not just thunderstorms that can release the ryegrass pollen or the lot peak.
Yeah,
that's
right. So there are other things which can cause grass pollen to fragment. So wind can cause grass pollen to fragment, the actual physical punching against surfaces, and also humidity. So humidity, as the humidity rises, grass pollen is dry particles. So the word pollen actually comes from the same word as flower, F-L-O-U-R. So polenta has got the same root as pollen. So if you know polenta, dry substance. So pollen is dry and it absorbs water out of the air. It can swell and burst. So as the humidity rises, we can see those pollen grains swelling and bursting and releasing those starch pollen granules as well.
So it's great. We might show a slide here where there is a storm front coming across the greater Melbourne area. And you can actually see as the storm front comes across the highlighted triple O cores that come out, obviously acute events that are occurring. Now, not all of them necessarily going to be asthma related, but you can show
all of those are asthma.
Oh, really? Were they? Oh, there you go.
This is the thunderstorm asthma event. So you can see in front of the gust front, there's a couple of things coming up, people with broken legs or whatever, but that's all people with thunderstorm asthma.
That makes the slide even more impressive, Ed, the fact that they're all related to respiratory events afterwards. And a great demonstration then of that effect. And I assume that every time a humid storm comes through, there's some degree of that, maybe not the same extent as a thunderstorm.
Yes.
While in Australia, we do see co-sensitization. The phenomenon of co-sensitization does exist elsewhere. And there are guidelines now how to manage patients who are polysensitized or co-sensitized to both temperate and subtropical grasses. We know that from SLIT studies that in Europe, where polysensitization, often with regards to birch pollen in conjunction with temperate grasses, has been studied, and in real world studies in Australia where there's the combination of temperate and subtropical grasses, that really the primary allergen is really all that's been recommended to treat. And so when there is sensitization, the primary allergen is what really is targeted. And I'm going to show you a slide here now that looks at some of that evidence. On the left here is some of the meta-analysis or summary data from the SLIT trials in Europe demonstrating that those who are monosensitized versus polysensitized still got a significant benefit in the least squares means on their symptom scores from monotherapy to the primary allergen. And although that's a nice data from a summary of studies that includes placebo, if we look at the Australian experience, there is data here showing both patients who are monosensitized in the light green and polysensitized in the dark green to show that with monotherapy to ryegrass, or the temperate grass component only, that they do equally as well. And surprisingly here, that actually in this study by Cheryl Van Nuenen, the actual improvement in symptom score is actually greater in the polysensitized patients, as it actually is in the European clinical trials as well.
And so it's really important to know a lot about your own local grass pollen, the types of grass pollen that are around, and be aware of that, know when that season is occurring so you can better manage your symptoms as you're coming into those grass pollen seasons, when you know you're going to be, your asthma is going to be badly affected, and you know the hay fever is going to be worse as well.
You know, I think as a clinician, I take away from this that we really need to be aware of the seasonality, what brings about the release of the grass pollen allergen, and some of the months that might predict whether someone's going to be temperate or subtropical colonized or sensitized. Additionally, where they live in Australia is a big part of that. But perhaps more importantly, when it comes to the actual treatment, it appears that treating the primary allergen is really what's important. And most of these patients that are both tropical and subtropical, co-sensitized, can really do very well symptomatically just from treatment with the primary allergen. And I think that's probably a big part of where some of the clinical implication occurs here.